Hello everyone and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. Today we'll be covering one of the most notorious enchantments in the history of Magic the Gathering because it doesn't function in a tournament setting very nicely, and some say it's not a real Magic card even. Sylvan Library. Let's begin. So let's look at the card first and actually realize why it is worded so weirdly and where the confusion happens. So, Sylvan Library is an enchantment for 1 and a green that reads, at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay for life or put the card back on top of your library. Now, where the problem with this card comes in is that you essentially have to denote somehow the cards you have drawn this turn. So, how you need to play if you have a Sylvan Library or even multiple play is that you need to keep the cards you draw with Sylvan Library separately than the rest of your hand. The reason for that is that if a card touches the rest of the cards in your hand, it is considered to be unknown for ruling reasons and for game reasons. So, one thing to remember here is that you need to keep the cards you draw separately. This comes up also in Commander, so if you play the card, you need to actually say, okay, I draw for my turn, then I draw the 2 from Sylvan Library. So, first things first, because I see this mistake a lot, the first thing that happens in the draw step is we draw our card for the turn. That's a turn-based action. Then all effects that trigger at the beginning of the draw step happen. So let's say we have Sylvan Library on a board. What happens is we draw our card for the turn. That's a turn-based action. We keep it separately because we have a Sylvan Library play. Then we draw 2 additional cards if we want. It's an option here, but you either have to draw 2 or no cards with Sylvan Library. There's no up to here. So let's say we decide to draw the cards. Then we have options. Essentially what Sylvan Library does, without saying specifically, because it's an old card, it's that you can pick which of the top 3 cards of your library you want. You can either pick all of them, pick one and put the other back in any order, pick 2 and put the other one back, or any other combination including those 6 cards. So, what happens is you pick the cards, you have them separately in our hand, the 3 cards, and then we say, okay, I'll keep them all. That's the easy part. You keep them all, you pay 8 life, you put them back in your hand. The other thing you can do is you can say, okay, I will keep only 2 cards, so that's 1 extra, so I only need to pay 4 life and put 1 card back. Or I can just keep any of the 3 and then put the other card back. That is the important part. You cannot put cards from the other cards in your hand back on top of your library. You have to be of the ones you have drawn this turn. That gets complicated, especially we have other effects like Holding Mines that draw more cards in our upkeep. So for every card we draw before the Sylvan Library trigger, we have to keep them separately in our hand to resolve the Sylvan Library trigger correctly. Now, notes here. Sylvan Library draws us cards, so any effect that could trigger of us drawing cards, of the opponent's drawing cards or whatever, like Smothering Tithe, will trigger for its card. So if we choose to draw cards from Sylvan Library and an opponent has Smothering Tithe in play, we will have to either pay 2 and 2 in order for them to make 0 treasures, pay 2 and then we'll make 1 treasure, or pay nothing and make 2 treasures. That's really important. This happens after we resolve the trigger, of course, but Smothering Tithe cares only that we drew the cards. So Sylvan Library draws the cards even if they might not end up in our hand. And that's what the basics of the card does. And now we see some interactions that are going to be weirdly with Sylvan Library. There are common legacy interactions though, and could happen in Commander sometimes, so you need to be aware of them. Some things I would like to also include here is that if we have more than one Sylvan Library somehow, we get to resolve them separately, each of them, so essentially you could end up drawing a total of +4 cards in your turn, but you will also lose 16 life. And also, while we are choosing what to do with our Sylvan Library cards, we cannot cast anything, obviously the whole trigger resolves and that effect happens. And the important part which comes up in a lot of interactions later if there is any placement effect happening, and that would cause us to actually draw less cards somehow. We still have to choose up to 2 cards we have drawn this turn, and then pay for life or put it back. So we need to be very careful with Sylvan Library. Let's go to the interactions. So the first interaction is Sylvan Library and Chains of Mephistopheles. Chains of Mephistopheles is another weird or enchantment that essentially reads that if you would draw a card except the one you draw on your draw strip, you stand discard the card to draw a new one. And that doesn't happen continuously because replacement effects cannot invoke themselves, so this will happen just once and then it's done. But if you had no cards in your hand and you would try to draw other than the first card in your turn, you mill a card. Now, the way this works with the library is a little bit weird. Let's assume we have 0 cards in hand. We draw for our turn. Then we have an option to either draw from Sylvan Library or not. Let's just say we draw, because if we don't draw, obviously nothing happens. If we choose to draw, then Chains of Mephistopheles sees each draw separately, because that's how replacement effects with draw work. And we essentially try to use this effect 2 times. So we draw the 1 card from Sylvan Library, we would attempt to do that, but because of Chains we have to discard and draw 1. So we discard and draw 1, then we have to draw another card, so we do the same, we discard that card, we drew, and we draw another one. Now, we're still resolving the effect of Sylvan Library, and Sylvan Library asks us to pay for life for up to 2 cards, or keep them. Now, because we have actually drawn this card, we have to either put it on top or pay for life. So in this case, Chains worked against us as intended, and we essentially filtered through 3 cards, but we have to pay the life to keep only 1 card, we don't get to draw any new ones. Now, if we didn't have any cards in hand, for some reason, let's say it was an instant that we played it in response to the Sylvan Library trigger, then what would happen is that we try to draw, have no cards in hand, we mill a card, and then again try to draw, have no cards in hand, we mill a card, and Sylvan Library sees that we have no cards in hand and doesn't care for us paying life. Now, if we had already cards in hand, obviously you essentially filter through 3 cards and then you have to pay 4 or 8 life to keep the other cards. That's a interaction that happens very often in Legacy, and also it gets even weirder if there are miracles involved or dredge cards, which we'll see in a bit. Next up is the interaction between Sylvan Library and Miracle Spells. Miracle Spells are a little bit weird because of their wording again, because it's a dexterity issue again. It only works if it's the first card drawn in your turn, so you all have to be careful if you're playing a miracle deck or a deck that has miracles in it to draw your card and look at it before you put it into your hand, because then again if it touches the cards in your hand, we cannot know what the card is. Now, what happens if you have a miracle on top, let's say Terminus and the Sylvan Library? So, we draw a card for our turn, because that's the turn-based action that happens before the triggers. When we draw that card, Miracle actually is a 2-step process. We have to reveal the card if it's the first card we draw it, and then we have an option, if it's still revealed, to cast it. Now, that's a trigger, and Sylvan Library is also a trigger, and it's a trigger that will happen at the same time, so we get to stack them as we want. If we choose to put the Terminus trigger first and the Sylvan Library later, then we resolve the Sylvan Library. We draw cards from the top. We draw the 2 cards, that's what we have to do if we choose to resolve the Sylvan Library trigger and draw the cards. So we draw the cards, we still keep the Terminus revealed. Okay, that's important. And then we get to decide. We decide we could either keep the cards or keep one and return one. Now, here's the important part. If we choose to actually return Terminus back, it's a 2-step process again. If we choose to return one card and it's the Terminus, the opponent will actually know that the Terminus goes on top of our deck. If we choose to return 2 cards, one of them being the Terminus, the opponent will know that the Terminus will go back on the library, because when cards go on top of the library, they are considered to be all on top of the library if it's more than 1 card even. And then what happens is that we essentially get to flip the face down, and the opponent will know that the terminus is either the first card or the second, but we don't have to reveal the location of the terminus. But also when the trigger of the terminus to cast it tries to resolve, because it's no longer revealed and not in our hand, we do not get to cast it. Simple as that. So essentially, if you choose to use the miracle trigger, you have to keep the miracle in your hand as the trigger resolves in order to be able to cast it. Now, what will happen if we went the other way around, so we put the Sylvan Library trigger on the stack first and the terminus after that, is that we choose at the moment the terminus trigger resolves to either cast it or not. If we choose to cast it, it casts and it goes to the graveyard. Then if we choose to draw cards from the Sylvan Library, we still have to choose cards from among those two. So if we choose to keep them both, we have to pay 8 life. If we choose to keep one of them, we have to pay 4 and return the other to the top. If we choose to keep none of them, we return them back on top in any order we want. So even though Terminus is cast, it still counts as a card drawn this turn for the purpose of a library. So we don't get to get scot-free just because we casted the card immediately. They still count as a card drawn for our turn. And now let's look at a little bit of a confusing interaction that actually technically needs a judge in presence in order to be able to be resolved correctly. So we have a suspended ancestral vision, which we remove the final encounter to cast it on an upkeep. There is a life from the loaf in our graveyard, a Sylvan Library, and the Chains of Mephistopheles on the field. What happens here? Okay, let's go through the steps. So on our upkeep, we remove the final encounter from ancestral vision, and we get to target the player to draw 3 cards. Let's say we target ourselves. Okay, now because of Chains of Mephistopheles, as we covered before, and this not being the draw card we draw on our draw step, we have to resolve essentially Chains 3 times. We already have a card in hand. And then we get to discard that card, draw a new one, discard that card, draw a new one, if we want to. But we also have life from the loaf in our graveyard. And this is also a replacement effect that will happen on the draw. So essentially the options we have here are, because when 2 replacement effects usually try to take effect and refer to the same thing, like Chains and Dredge here referring to drawing cards, the affected player, which is us at this point, chooses the order which these effects will apply, which would mean that if Life from the Loaf applies it to any of those draws, Chains would no longer be able to apply the draw since it's no longer existing. For that reason, we have choice here to make. Let's say we choose not to dredge Life from the Loam for any of the 3 draws. So Chains will happen, we'll discard the card we were holding in our hand, draw a new one, discard, draw a new one, discard, draw a new one. Then Visions goes to the graveyard. Now we have our draw step. Again on our draw step, we have an option to, instead of drawing a card for the turn, dredge Life from the Loam back into our hand. Chains does not apply here because it is our draw step draw. Let's say now that we chose not to apply Life from the Loam and we get to draw a card in hand. Now we have 2 cards in hand. Now we have a Sylvan Library trigger. Try to resolve. We resolve the trigger and choose to draw cards. Now again we have replacement effects that will happen here. Let's say we replace the first draw of the Sylvan Library with the Life from the Loam Dredge effect. So we mill 3 and we add 1 card in our hand. And then we use the Chains replacement effect to discard the card and draw a new one. So we now have, before applying the Chains effect, Life from the Loam plus 2 cards in hand. And we choose to discard a card that is not Life from the Loam and draw a new card from Sylvan Library. Here is the really interesting part, because Sylvan Library can return only cards drawn this turn, but as we already mentioned, Life from the Loam is in our hand, and it's essentially an unknown card, but we cannot return Life from the Loam to our top of the deck because it's not a card drawn this turn, it was added with its replacement dredge effect from the graveyard to our hand. Here is we need to call the judge, or we need to have already the judge present, to see that we are not putting Life from the Loam back on top of our library. Now, if we choose to keep all the cup with Sylvan Library and lose the 8 life, we can do that, and that's fine. If we choose to return one card, we cannot return the life from the loam. So essential options here are keep all the cards, take 8 or pay 8 life, return one card that's not life from the loam and lose 4 life, or return both unknowns and keep life from the loam into our hand. So this is an interaction where you actually, even though you're playing with physical cards and you are using all the dexterity tricks we already talked about, where we keep the cards separate, we don't mix them up, you still need someone, especially a judge, to confirm that the cards not returned back is not Sylvan Library, which is fascinating if you think about it. And those were some of the most known interactions with Sylvan Library. I know it's a very confusing card to play because you have to do the dexterity issue thing. Even though it's not complicated as to what it does, you have to know how to play it in order to play it, which is a result from it being a very old card. If it was printed nowadays, it would probably be like something banish the cards face down and then for each card you add in your hand, but that's different from draw. Now it is worded as it is and it has very confusing interactions and you need to be very careful. It wouldn't be as much of a problem if it wasn't a tournament legal legacy card, but since it is, you have to know it if you're planning to play legacy or you'll be finding yourself very sad. Thank you very much for watching, hope you learned something today and see you in the next video.